All right, guys. So for this lecture and the next couple lectures, we're going to try to make it our way through a little bit of some of the parts of the actual brain itself. So we're going to look at the lobes today specifically, and then we'll get into some of the basic parts of those lobes kind of going forward. So let's go ahead and kind of jump in here. So we're going to be specifically looking at the central nervous system. So we'll start off here looking a little bit at the spinal cord itself and then get into some of the chambers of the brain here in a second. But when we look at the development of the central nervous system, when we first start to develop as embryos, that central nervous system, specifically our brain and spinal cord, develop as what we call a neural tube. So it's just a fold of tissue that kind of wraps around itself that eventually will become both our brain and spinal cord. The opening of those neural tubes will start to form what are called the ventricles. So the chambers within the brain, and there are 4 specific ventricles, and then eventually those ventricles will become filled with spinal fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, and it forms a couple functions. So it provides the brain with nutrients, but also provides protection. So the brain is kind of suspended within the skull in that cerebral spinal fluid. So we'll kind of look at those. Spinal cord itself is going to extend from the base of the brain, which is called the medulla oblongata, all the way to about T12. So that's the 12th thoracic vertebra. So right before we get into our lumbar vertebra. Anything below T12 is referred to as the caudal equina. So a caudal equina essentially equates to a horse's tail. So everything below that sort of looks like the tail of a horse. And it's just the collection of spinal nerves that then run out into the lower extremities as well as the lower half of the abdomen. There are 2 enlargements, areas that are just a little bit bigger than the rest of the spinal cord, and those happen at the cervical region and lumbar region. So you can see those here on the diagram. So we have a cervical enlargement here and a lumbar enlargement here. And that's mostly because there are extremities attached to those. So this enlargement would be associated with the 2 extremities, the 2 upper arms. And this enlargement then would be associated with the lower legs and a lot of these abdominal organs. Okay. When we look at anatomy of the spinal cord, we've got some gray matter and white matter. So the exterior is mostly white matter, so you can see that around here. And those are essentially the conducting tracts or the axon portion of the nerve cells. They look and appear white because those are the myelinated sections. The internal portion then is our gray matter, and those don't have any myelin on them because they are mostly then those cell bodies. They are surrounding kind of this little portion here in the center called the central canal. That's actually a hollow portion of the spinal cord all the way from the top to the bottom. And then obviously we have a dorsal horn posterior, so that's going to the back, and a anterior or ventral horn that's going to the front of each one of those. Okay. The central canal, I just kind of talked about that already. It's got a little bit of cerebral spinal fluid in it. It kind of helps hold the shape of the spinal cord itself. And then the spinal cord is covered with these little things, layers called meninges, and we'll talk a little bit about those later on when we talk about the brain, because those meninges are also on the brain. Nerves in the spinal cord leave at each vertebra, so there's a little kind of facet joint or kind of a section inside of each one of the vertebra that the nerve is going to leave through. Again, there's a dorsal and ventral. So the dorsal horn is associated with just the collection of nerves that are outside the central nervous system. So just again, a big thing here is to notice that the dorsal root is going to the back, ventral root is going to the front or anterior. From there, we'll get into a little bit of some of the regions of the brain, and we're mostly going to talk kind of specifically about these sections here. So we've got cerebral hemispheres, right? So that's the cerebral hemisphere, the largest portion of the brain. There are 2 halves to that. We have another section called the diencephalon. That's a little section here in blue that actually the pituitary gland is associated with. Then there's the brain stem, so it's the enlarged segment at the top portion of the spinal cord. And then there is the cerebellum, kind of this little, to me it almost looks like a walnut, kind of because of the little grooves and ridges in it, give it that kind of appearance. But we're going to go through and talk about each one kind of these separately. So let's start with the cerebral hemispheres. There are paired parts of the brain, so there's a right and left. And they include more than half of the mass of the brain. So they're the largest section that we have, all right, and they take up the biggest portion, and it's got most of our kind of computing processes within that. The lobes of the cerebellum, there's a little bit of some markings on the outside, so there are these ridges and grooves that you can see here. So the ridges are the protruding portions, the grooves are the kind of the depressions. The ridges are known as gyri or gyri, however you want to pronounce that. It really makes no difference. Just know that these two go together. And the way that I know that is that gyri has an R in it, and those are the ridges. Grooves does not have an R in it, or has an R in it, but doesn't start with an R. So it probably doesn't make sense to you, but it does to me. So this starts with an R. There's an R in that. This one doesn't start with an R, and there's no R in this. So the ridges are the gyri, the grooves are the sulci. There are some sections that are a little bit deeper. So these are just deeper grooves called fissures. And there are several of them that divide the brain up into its separate lobes. So you can see we have a frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal. So frontal is the pink area here. Parietal is the kind of darker blue or kind of light blue. The really light blue is the occipital, and then the temporal is here on the sides of the brain. This just shows you a little bit more of a cross section. So now we've cut the brain essentially in half. You can see the openings. All right, so here is again frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital. Temporal is actually over here because where you can't see the side of it. You can see there are some ventricles on the inside here. So these are openings within the brain, and then you can see how all the other pieces kind of fit in there. Kind of going a little bit more into what they do. So frontal lobe is the area of primary motor control. So this is what allows us to consciously move our skeletal muscles. It's also associated with a lot of the other areas of the brain that are associated with reasoning, planning, emotions, language comprehension, as well as problem solving. So if somebody has damage to this part of the brain, this is why so many things can be disrupted. So if we have either a cerebral spinal incident, so if we have say like a large concussion or a hematoma in this part of the brain, that's why people can have those kind of issues. If we have a stroke that affects that part of the brain, you can see why that would affect so many different areas. There are a couple specialized areas in the cerebrum that are responsible for specific things. So there's what's called the Broca's area. This is specifically responsible for speech. So if we have damage to that Broca's area, people can lose their ability to kind of comprehend and plan speech. The Gustoria area, that's responsible for taste, gustatoria area, sorry. And then there's also this is the area of the brain that stores complex memories. So that's why things like Alzheimer's and things like that, people lose those memories because that's affecting this part of the brain. Interestingly enough, this is the part of the brain that is still under development until we reach kind of adulthood. So that's why, especially teenagers and kids of your age, really kind of struggle with that reasoning portioning. And unfortunately, we as adults just think that we should be able to do that. But your brain still is kind of functioning and still kind of developing, and it isn't able to kind of do that or control those planning and emotions as well. So that area of the brain is still under development, which is why it's important to kind of not do anything that would kind of affect that. So that's why concussions are such a big thing in adolescent sports anymore, because we know that is going to create issues with these. It's also with drugs. Drugs affect the cerebrum highly as well. So this area isn't done growing, isn't done developing, and those drugs can kind of affect that area as well. Parietal lobe is mostly sensory. So this is going to receive impulses from the body's sensory receptors. And really what we're looking at are those three main types of senses. So anything with pain, temperature, as well as touch, which is, again, if there's damage to this area, people can then have issues with those different senses as well. Occipital lobe, this is the one that contains the visual area of the brain. So any damage to the back of the brain can damage our brain's ability to perceive vision. And then the temporal region is the area that contains both auditory as well as olfactory, and then also stores some more of our complex memories in this area. So again, damage to this area, people could lose their ability to smell, and they could also lose their ability to comprehend speech in this area. Okay. Um, all right, we're going to go ahead and stop there at this section. We'll pick back up with the rest of the brain tomorrow, and then we'll finish this up on Monday. So we're going to try to break this up into 3 sections for you guys.